All right, let's get into some quick debate review. And when I say quick, I'm going to try to make it quick. I have sped up the clips of the debates that I will be referencing because this is already going to be a long video because there's a lot of content. I'm making this because I really believe this stuff. I believe it is important to review, and I'm not trying to come at Tom when I say here that TJump, Tom, just shared so much faulty thinking and misinformation. And not only that, but he did dominate the conversation as far as taking the time, talking over me, and even having more time be given to him by the moderator. The moderator and I talked afterwards. Mod was great, but I don't think it was very structured. And I do think that if I ever debate Tom again, I'm going to have to insist on a debate in which one of us talks for 1 or 2 minutes while the other's mic is muted, and then there's a rebuttal. Because as I went through the debate, and I'll break down some numbers in a little bit here, but I could hardly get through an answer for 10 plus seconds without being interrupted. So I do think that's a problem. Bottom line here, I just think that some of the misinformation, faulty thinking, and some of the evidences being shared here are too important not to clarify and not to follow up on without being interrupted. And some of the blatant hypocrisy on Tom's part, and thus those who support him, are also too important to go uncorrected. So I was jokingly going to title this possibly Tom versus Truth or Tom versus Logic, but I think that for several of the portions, Tom versus Tom is kind of the best title. So that's probably what I'm going to be going with. But anyway, diving into it, let's go to our first topic. Regardless of whose quote unquote side you're on here, I want you to pay attention to this exchange. Notice the viewpoints and the general overarching arguments by each side, and then let's compare this to a previous debate that Tom had.
I agree. It does necessitate an ultimate source of morality for objective morality. It just doesn't need a God. So, but again, something we already knew about, you can't claim that as evidence.
Morality comes from?
It can come from lots of things. It can come from Platonic object, an a priori abstract, law of the universe, a moral law.
No. So this is what you do. You scattershot out a bunch of random words, and then you don't define any of them. This would be like saying it could come from a god. It could come from Zeus. It could come from Yahweh. It could come from Poseidon. Come from Neptune. No, you need to define how it would come from any of those things.
So I'm listing, when I do that, just to clarify,
evidence.
When I do that, I'm listing things that are well established in philosophy that you can just Google, because like if I list colors, red, blue, yellow, green, I don't need to define what those are because these are well understood terms in the field.
Yeah, give it to me.
What?
Ultimate source of morality. Go ahead.
Platonic field, a priori abstracts, moral naturalism, any of those work. Again, these lists, I don't need to explain that. It's a stupid question. Like if I give you a list of colors and you ask me, well, why is that yellow? You can Google it on your own. This is well discovered.
That's not what I'm asking.
It literally is.
No,
I'm literally what. So a Platonic object is a moral object.
Something as an explanation. I'm asking you to show how it is an explanation. That's not asking you to describe the color yellow.
Established things.
You're supposed to have the knowledge to present your viewpoint. The existence of absolute morality, which we both just agreed exists, is evidence for God. I can explain how that is on my side if you want me to, but I'd like you to explain on your side.
So again, the reason I list these things is they are well established and just show that you're ignorant of philosophy. Wait, stop. I could explain these. I could. I don't care to because it's not relevant to the point. You made a claim.
It is relevant.
You need morality for God. I just gave you a whole list.
And you can't back it up. This is like the fourth time.
I can back it up. It's just irrelevant to my point. I want to go back to my point.
You have to find your claims.
Oh my God! Stop talking. Stop talking. Stop talking. Previous
statement about you can't give an alternative. You're saying words, but you're not defining how they're an alternative. So, for instance, I could say if I were arguing against me, if I were to be the devil's advocate, I could say, well, yeah, Luke, unicorns could have done it. Unicorns could have given consciousness. Is that an argument? That's not an argument. That's just me saying words and not defining them. You haven't defined any of what you just said. You just said, quantum this could have, or Hinduism or something. And I said, can you define any of those beliefs? And you said, no, but I've cited them. That's not an argument. That is.
So this is. I had a follow-up.
When I say it's possible, I mean I leave myself open to hearing good arguments. I haven't heard anything like that. I've heard you invoke chakra and random quantum theories that are undefined by you, as you love to do. You love to invoke these.
None of that is important.
For viewers, I'd encourage them to look into different string theory, quantum field theories, quantum tunneling theory, because honestly, there are so many competing theories around the entire quantum discussion. I've never seen you in any of your discussions explain exactly which one you believe accounts for your worldview and specifically the origins of the universe. I'd love to hear you explain exactly which theory of quantum mechanics and it is that you believe explains and justifies your belief.
Any of the ones that make novel predictions and get them correct.
That's not an answer.
That's a perfect answer. But it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant.
Any theory. Which one? Because there are competing theories which are mutually exclusive. Which one, Tom? Which one?
It doesn't matter. Like what?
All right. So I found that pretty ridiculous. You might disagree with me, but at least I've got Tom on my side. Tom might be able to convince Tom. Check it out.
You just said a guy had a bunch of papers. That doesn't help. Just saying a guy has 9,000 documents isn't interesting. You need to like present one of the documents and say, here's one of the documents that shows something going on at this time period. Like that would be good. Or
really?
If somewhere in the document it said something that is evidence.
Can you speak?
There's no reason to, because you presented no reason to support, to think that anything you said.
Well, to be honest with you, I think the 7 things I list is quite enough to go off.
Except you didn't give any of those. You just gave references for other people to look up.
So Tom doesn't like when people come to a debate and just cite things, but don't present any of them, and furthermore dive into the reasons as to why their citation matters and why it should be further researched by the listeners. I think that's what he's saying. But let's let Tom expound on what he thinks.
Documents and 2,000 publications, historical, and that's not enough, is it not? That's not enough to confirm.
Present any of them. You just said he has papers. People presenting the information in debates. I did no research. I just watched the debate. So I was watching a debate with Richard Dawkins, and Richard Dawkins was saying, here is how evolution works. And he said he wrote a book about it. Forget, was it the whichever one, his first one. And he then illustrated how DNA works and how evolution works and how natural selection works. Now, I did no research here. I just listened to what he said, and what he said.
Okay, so Tom really likes when evidence is presented and explained by the person who is citing it in a debate. But maybe there's some nuance to it. Maybe he doesn't think that that's always the right path forward. Hopefully he'll explain that. Maybe claims and citations can still count as evidence even if you don't explain how they apply to the argument. Let's see.
So again, none of that is evidence. You just listed a bunch of titles. I can list titles.
Is that not a consensus?
No, it's not. The consensus against you. The consensus said it did not occur. You would actually have to go through those titles, find the quotes, find the historical documents themselves, and indicate they did actually infiltrate the Freemasons.
Oh, so
you haven't brought up anything yet. You just said they exist.
So basically, you deny all them.
No. I haven't denied anything. Stop saying I deny. I haven't denied anything. I said you have said nothing. Listing a title and saying the title supports your conclusion is unsupported. Those don't work. I can just list the Bible. The Bible says I'm right. That is not necessarily true. Just saying the title isn't evidence. You'd have to actually show where in this document it actually supports your conclusion, then present this evidence to the consensus to evaluate whether or not it's true. Where in anything did you present that the Illuminati was infiltrated, or the Freemasons were infiltrated by the Illuminati?
Historians, scholars,
where? Like, pull it up. Show me where exactly you supported this.
Okay, guys, I mean, there you have it. But at least we can agree that the version of Luke from my debate with Tom and the version of Tom from his debate with someone else about the existence of the Illuminati would certainly get along very well and would see eye to eye in their lines of reasoning and logic.
Go ahead.
Platonic field, a priori abstracts, moral naturalism, any of those work. Again, these lists, I don't need to explain that. It's a stupid question. You have said nothing. Listing a title and saying the title supports your conclusion is unsupported. Those don't work. I can just list the Bible. The Bible says I'm right. That is not necessarily true. Just saying the title isn't evidence. You'd have to actually show where in this document it actually supports your conclusion, then present this evidence to the consensus to evaluate whether or not it's true.
Well, to be honest with you, I think I provided sufficient.
Okay, I think you get it. But I just want to reiterate one more time that this version of Tom...
You have said nothing. Listing a title and saying the title supports your conclusion is unsupported. Those don't work. I can just list the Bible. The Bible says I'm right. That is not necessarily true.
Sounds a whole lot like this version of me in our debate.
No, but you can't give an alternative. You're saying words, but you're not defining how they're an alternative. So for instance, I could say, if I were arguing against me, if I were to be the devil's advocate, I could say, well, yeah, Luke, unicorns could have done it. Unicorns could have given consciousness. Is that an argument? That's not an argument. That's just me saying words and not defining them. You haven't defined any of what you just said. You just said, quantum this could have, or Hinduism or something. And I said, can you define any of those beliefs? And you said, no, but I've cited them. That's not an argument. That is.
So this is, I had a follow.
How about another contradiction? In my debate with Tom, he said that historical evidence for Jesus, and specifically testimony, wasn't evidence at all. But let's see what he said outside of my debate with him.
So what's your standard for evidence?
The
of history.
Consensus in history, you'd have to actually convince the consensus in history that it occurred. Something isn't evidence.
So how would you determine Hitler existed then?
By the historical consensus. I look at the evidence they would present, which is like historical documents, testimony, the bodies, the geological evidence, archaeological evidence.
Next, let's go into Tom's treatise on the problem of undetermination and his misrepresentation thereof. What had happened here is Tom is claiming that scientific discoveries made by whether creationists or naturalists, doesn't really matter, he makes that point very clear, point towards naturalism, point towards, or rather point away from creationism. He can't give an example, though, of one discovery that was discovered which supports naturalism but doesn't support God, or which was discovered specifically presupposing naturalism and excluding God and saying, if we discover this, it will be evidence in the case of naturalism, but not in the case of God. And that is exactly the type of evidence that he would need in order for his problem of undetermination to not apply to him. He also makes the incorrect claim that no evidences have ever been presented presupposing creationism. No scientific discoveries have ever happened saying, we believe the Bible, thus we will do this experiment and show you what we expect to find as our hypothesis, and then they did indeed find something like or similar to their hypothesis. That's simply not true, because those things have happened. Admittedly, this is a point that I was not immediately ready to answer because it's one that I'm not completely memorized and well versed in. However, it doesn't change the fact that he lied about it when he acted like he was certain of it and he was well versed in it.
You can make any evidence you want fit any hypothesis with post hoc reasoning. You can never, ever exclude another hypothesis. It's literally impossible. That's not how evidence works.
Discovery, and you're crediting it to a worldview, to a belief.
No. So if there's a prediction made by a worldview, so naturalism is true, if naturalism is true, we'll be able to look in brains and see what you're going to do or whatever. So if you have a hypothesis that makes a prediction and that prediction is discovered to be correct, it's novel. It has to be something we don't already know yet. It's like a bubble will pop. Anybody could predict that, not novel. If it's a novel prediction that nobody else was expecting and is correct, that would be evidence of naturalism. Even if God could also explain it, post hoc doesn't matter. Anybody can post hoc explain anything. It's called the problem of undetermination. Therefore, evidence is simply the ability to predict new information before we discover it, because not everybody can do that. So you don't need to exclude creationism. Irrelevant. Also, whether or not creationists did work in a field doesn't mean that's evidence of creationism. Because again, you have to start with the hypothesis that God exists or a creator exists, and then build from that hypothesis an expected conclusion. First thing, you're wrong. You do not need to exclude other hypotheses. This is a fact in philosophy known as the problem of undetermination. You can always post hoc explain any data to make it fit any hypothesis ever. So
the problem of undetermination is simply this. It's when the data at any given point is insufficient to determine exactly which belief is the accurate or most reasonable belief, and it's insufficient to exclude the other beliefs and help you come to that final conclusion. That's the problem of undetermination. So let me give you an example. If you know that I have $30 and that there are 5 items for sale, 2 of the items are $50, 1 of them is $10, and 2 of them are $30, and I tell you, I just bought outright 1 item, then you know that based on the data you have, you can exclude 2 of the options because I could not outright buy the $50 items, so we can take 2 of them off the table. However, I could have bought either of the 2 $30 items, or I could have bought the $10 item. That would be a situation where the problem of undetermination arises. The data available isn't sufficient to exclude all of the possibilities and to draw a conclusion. That is my point here. When Tom claims the data about various scientific discoveries and tries to credit them strictly to a non-theist worldview, he has to show how the data excludes a theist or creator, intelligent designer worldview. If he can't do that, then his data only fits into the undetermined part of the problem of undetermination. I asked him multiple times in this debate to give me an example of a scientific discovery or proven theory that excludes intelligent design as one of the possibilities. He needs to show that, to go back to my analogy, intelligent design is one of the 50s, that it's impossible. Otherwise, the evidence he's presenting simply fits into data, which is defined as part of the problem of undetermination. And yet he says this is a problem for me. Couple this with the fact that many theists and deists who are also high-level scientists and inventors have existed and have contributed a lot throughout history, and Tom's problem starts to grow. You see, theists and deists do not reject science as a way of gaining knowledge. If they did, then all scientific discoveries would be something that excludes theism and deism. However, they do not do that. As a matter of fact, historically speaking, the majority of discoveries and inventions were by theists and deists. Again, returning to our example, let's call this option naturalism or evolutionary theory or those types of ideas that tend to run together, and let's call this option creationism, intelligent design, or theism. Every scientific discovery in history, and certainly every one that Tom cited, could either be described and explained as evidence for or part of the theory of naturalism or creationism. It would work in both cases. On top of that, the majority of science, both historically and today, is contributed to and very often spearheaded by theists, creationists, and people who believe in some form of intelligent design. Tom wants to claim every successful scientific experiment or theory proven as evidence for naturalism, but not theism. But he refuses to show how it is exclusively evidence for one and not the other, and thus the fallacy that he brought up supports me and not him. All right, let's get into our next discussion in Tom versus Tom. In the first clip, Tom is going to give you one view of how intelligent design necessitates intelligent design, and in the next clip, he's going to deny that when I make the same claim.
Comes to mind is that a mind itself would be a purposeful arrangement of parts. And so if you were to infer that anything, particularly like Mount Rushmore or whatever, had a purposeful arrangement of parts, and that was created by a mind, then you would also have to infer that the mind was a purposeful arrangement of parts, and then it must have a designer. And so you lead this infinite regress argument that there's no actual way to posit a designer of any kind without actually positing a more complicated explanation of the hypothesis.
Let's stop right there. All right, so Tom just said that if Mount Rushmore has a purposeful arrangement of parts, and it's designed by a mind, which thus must also have a purposeful arrangement of parts, which thus must also be designed by something which has a purposeful arrangement of parts, into infinite regression. That is what he said.
Than simply saying it was an unknown natural process. So like if I said Mount Rushmore was a result of an unknown natural process, it's possible, there's no logical contradiction there, but that seems to be equally as improbable as saying it was an unknown kind of designer. So if I said it was a designer that was a product of evolution, since we have a decent, from a naturalist perspective, as I believe that humans evolved, if I said that a evolved being created this, because I already have past evidence of evolved beings, that seems rational. But if I said there was some unknown force that created a mind and that mind created this feature, then I must necessarily infer that that mind has a designer and that mind has a designer and that mind has a designer with a potential infinite regress. And so I see a problem with the argument for design here, that any functions, any object we have that has a purposeful design would necessarily have to be created by something that would also be a purposeful design.
All right, real quick pause again. Let's unpack this. So again, Tom reiterates that his problem with design is that it begets design, and it necessitates design behind it, up until possible infinite regress. Now, the creationist point, which I presented in our debate, is that yes, there is the unmoved mover, which is a philosophical term, which means there is a final designer. There is a final ultimate design, a conscious designer, which started that chain of all the design. So it's not quite infinite regress, but it's regress back to the final, ultimate, original designer. Now, his alternative to that is what he says could be something like an unknown natural process emerging from evolution. And he thinks that that is more reasonable than saying that you have to regress back to an original mind. That is what he's saying here. That's exactly what I presented in our argument, and he said it was inaccurate.
Yeah. So I would agree with what I thought you were saying in the Mount Rushmore video. I'll take you at your word if you say I got it wrong, but I'm going to be looking up clips and posting them later because I don't think I got it wrong. And I would agree with what Alex O'Connor said, which is that consciousness requires a conscious design behind that, requires a conscious design behind that, into infinite regression. Now, so consciousness and design require a designer behind it, require an intentional conscious designer behind it, infinite regression.
Why?
And I would say that the final in that step would make sense to be a conscious, powerful creator.
All right, so there you have it. Tom agrees with me until he's in a debate with me, and then it's not convenient to agree with me, so he doesn't anymore. Up next, let's see some quick redefining and moving the goalpost at the hands of Tom.
First thing is, even if God is outside of space and time, you can still test it with science. Science works on anything ever inside out space time, outside of space time. Doesn't make a difference. Science doesn't care where it is. If God sent Jesus and Jesus died and rose from the dead, that would be evidence of a God outside of space time. A thing outside of space time could send a person, have that person killed, and then revive them 3 days later. That's evidence. That's a novel, testable prediction. That would be evidence.
Here we go. Tom recognizes that the exact Christian claim about how we know that Jesus was God is what would be excellent proof. But then he tries to restate his argument. First, he says, if it happened, as in, if it happened at all, it would be excellent proof. But then as he starts to get a little bit more flustered and pressed on the point, he says, no, if it's repeatable, meaning if it happens every time someone prays for it. Check this clip out.
It's extremely repeatable and testable. It's very, very easy. Ask God. I believe in God. I'm going to pray to God. Put hands together. Sky Daddy God, give me a person. Just want you to generate them. Just snap your fingers. Poof, person. I'm going to kill him. Going to just smack him in the head with a baseball bat. And then you're going to revive him 3 days later. He does it. Poof. That's evidence of God.
You see, claiming that something happened and thus it's good proof, and specifically, as the Christian claim makes, that it happened, it was a very special event which happened once, which is part of what makes it special and what part of what made it necessary. And that is the proof, versus having something happen every time that someone, as Tom says, puts their hands together and prays to Sky Daddy for someone to kill and raise again. Those are not the same types of proof. Those are not the same types of evidence. Tom moves from one to the other as though they are, because that's what supports his argument best. Now, if he didn't do sneaky goalpost moving like this and denying that he and I actually agree on our points of logic, we would have been able to spend a lot more time on the actual proofs and moving through different topics of discussion. But because he kept contradicting himself on things he had said either in this debate or in other debates, which I had witnessed, and then he would either outright lie and say that he never said them, he never meant them, that I was misrepresenting them, as I've shown a few examples of already, we had to keep going back, retreading the argument, and trying to trudge forward, which was impossible. All right, let's move on to how Tom recognizes the strength of arguments like novel predictions about the future and prophecy. You'll have to remember this for a little later on. Remember how much he recognizes emphatically that these would be excellent proofs.
So you asked a question, how would we test for a thing outside of space-time? The answer to that is you make any prediction about the future, things we don't know yet, things we haven't happened yet, future testable prediction about the future, and say, here is something we predict that we've never seen before. And if it happens, and it's not something we've seen before and we've never predicted it before, that's evidence of your hypothesis. So if your hypothesis is being outside of space-time, there's lots of Christian claims that would be evidence if they were true. Lots of them. Like miracles would be evidence if they were true. Resurrection's evidence if they were true. Prophecies would be evidence if they were true. Revelation, if the stuff in Revelation happens, that would be evidence if it's true. So there are lots of claims Christian.
There you have it. There's his early view on prophecy and novel claims about the future, about things that we have not witnessed happening yet. He makes that very clear. It was really hard to get on a topic and stay on a topic because this is kind of what Tom does, and I said this in the debate. He just throws out a lot of information and misinformation, scattershots it, and then insists that you answer in the way he wants, when he wants, in the time frame that he wants you to. And if you don't, he just cuts you off, or he keeps ranting, or he changes the topic again with a new scattershot. That said, he brought up accurate predictions again, this time in reference to scientific predictions. However, accurate, novel predictions that no one knew about the future or about science all kind of run in the same vein as impressive pieces of evidence that your worldview, which you use to attain those predictions, is correct, whether it's in regards to science or world events or anything about the future that we couldn't have proven or hadn't been proven previously. So, using that, I circled back around to the topic of prophecy. Now remember what he said about predictions about the future and the strength of prophecy. But when I came back to that finally, after wading through his scattershots later in the argument, this is what he said.
The Bible has a lot of prophecy that happened hundreds or
Again, none of that is relevant to my point.
Unfortunately, this conversation was riddled with convenient contradictions by TJump and just constant word flow that made it impossible to accurately and efficiently call him out on those contradictions. So let's get into some false claims about science and history.
That they hadn't discovered, that they believed would be there to be discovered because they believed that it was ordered by a creator. So things like atoms or the motion of planets.
No,
or
atoms were discovered by Boltzmann. Boltzmann was an atheist.
Here he says atoms were discovered by Dalton and Dalton was an atheist. That's simply not true. Atoms were discovered by John Dalton. He is the father of atomic theory, and he was a Quaker. He never renounced his Quaker beliefs. He wasn't very public about his religious beliefs, but he certainly never stated that he was an atheist. It's just a false claim.
Hypothesis.
What do you mean by a creationist hypothesis?
So like,
give me an example of one
sure.
and why it is disqualified in one of the studies. Give me one of the studies. You just said you Googled some and why it is disqualified by a creationist hypothesis.
Because it doesn't make predictions. So the reason they're disqualified is because they haven't made predictions.
No, but give me a discovery. You said that you Googled many that were discovered by creationists, but they were not discovered because that person first presupposed an action that would be caused by creation. So give me an example.
So like Hubble discovered that the universe was receding or whatever, but that wasn't because he said God exists and God made the universe recede, therefore we would discover the universe was receding. He said it was because of, we just made observations in a telescope.
Here he says that Hubble is an example of a creationist who made a discovery, but they did not make that discovery because of their creationist beliefs, because they believed in God. And that discovery did not affirm their belief in God. It didn't aid them in the pursuit of making that hypothesis and then affirming it. However, the problem here is Hubble was not a creationist. He does not seem to have been a religious person at all. He's kind of like the opposite of Dalton, in that Hubble was public about his religious beliefs, and though he was raised Christian, he openly questioned them and seems quite clear in the idea that he doesn't really credit anything to God at all. So this example given by TJump is just a non-example. Next, we will see TJump claim that an archaeological discovery of something cited in the Bible to have existed, like the Tower of Babel, would be a solid piece of evidence. He then later says that actually the Tower of Babel isn't exclusive to the Bible, so it wouldn't necessarily be great evidence. And when I do cite archaeological examples, like Pontius Pilate, who was not confirmed by archaeology until 1961, and then was confirmed, proving that at least a piece of what the Bible said is true. And that's what this whole argument is, putting together pieces of evidence. I'm not saying that any single piece of evidence proves the whole case, but we have to look at them in their entirety, which is very hard to do with someone like TJump who interrupts all the time. But nonetheless, when I pointed towards this piece of evidence, he then said, first, that actually, well, there are many Pontius Pilates, so we're not sure which one it was. Then when I pushed back on that a bit, and once he seems to have Googled it on his screen here, he realizes, no, this actually was pretty much universally confirmed to be the Pontius Pilate of the Bible. Then he says, but that's not good evidence because it's just a person that's referenced, and we know that humans exist. As if referencing a specific person from human history is not relevant because we know that humans in general exist. That's ridiculous. That's like saying that if I reference that my wife specifically will do something or did do something, and in order to test the veracity of my claim, you say, well, the fact that your wife did it and was proven to have done it once we looked into it doesn't say anything because we know humans exist and humans do things, so that doesn't mean that we can trust you anymore. That's bogus. I made a specific claim, and that specific claim about that specific person in that specific time was shown to be true. That's a piece of evidence in support of my story. That's my point here. That's the point that TJump either doesn't want to admit or that he can't realize.
Like a novel prediction of creationism would be like, if I believed God existed and created the universe, we would discover, the Tower of Babel or something early on in the Bible. The example I gave was of a particular structure, that's endemic to Christianity, like the Tower of Babel. It's only in Christianity. Actually, it's not, but let's say suppose it was. That show existed. Independent of Christianity. That's not a prediction. There was a person named this. It's like if I read Spider-Man, like say 2,000 years from now, I read Spider-Man and it said, oh, look, there's the Times Square station. And I go back and see the Times Square station. Is that evidence that Spider-Man exists? No, it's not. It's not a novel prediction. Novel means something we haven't seen before. We've seen tons of humans.
Moving to his Spider-Man example, no, simply saying that there was a man called Spider-Man and he swung around in Times Square, and then someone reading that in thousands of years and seeing, oh, there was a place called Times Square, that wouldn't prove Spider-Man. However, if the claim about Spider-Man in Times Square was made, and then Times Square was confirmed, and then there were other pieces of evidence, witnesses, other archaeology, other things, logic that lead us to think that also those all point in the direction of Spider-Man, then yes, the case for Spider-Man would start to be stronger and stronger. So that's a pretty bad example on his part. There's just so much content here that needs to be corrected. I can't go through and get all the clips. So I am going to breeze through a few points from my notes and we will wrap it up with that. My first point is simply on time. I mentioned this early on in this video, and it's that I did a brief survey of the first 6 times that I spoke and was interrupted in the debate. And in those first 6 times, I spoke for an average of 6 seconds each time before being interrupted by TJump. The first 4 times, on the other hand, that he spoke when I interrupted him, he spoke for an average of 31 seconds before I interrupted him. So in other words, I let him get out at least a semblance of a full thought. And then around that point, the moderator tried to step in and correct him, and he told the moderator not to interrupt him. It was pretty wild. Elsewhere, he says that the creation of time, space, and matter is solved by the quantum fields, and he cites things like the Casimir effect as pieces of evidence for that. The problem is that no quantum theory, no quantum fields, no interpretation of the Casimir effect reflect what he's claiming. Here's a few pieces of evidence and scientific discussion on it. You can go do your own research. I did plenty of my own. It's all over the place that what he's saying as far as origins being solved by quantum fields is just a false claim. I made the point that we have only ever observed intentional design and consciousness coming about at the hands of something that was itself intentionally designed and or conscious. So like a human designing something in the realm of Mount Rushmore or human reproduction. He then tried to play semantics and say, no, actually that's just biology, which has produced consciousness. But then this goes to a discussion which we didn't have the ability to have due to the nature of this debate, which is, are our brains simply biology, or is there something more to them which we could call consciousness or intent? So in that realm, I'd say when my brain synapses are firing and controlling my motor nerves, that doesn't say anything about the intent or the conscious mind or the personality behind them. We haven't found any of that. When I'm firing my motor nerves and moving my hands to make cookies, there is no traceable intent or information about cookies in my mind that biology can explain. That is something called consciousness, personality, intent, and free will. Those things play into that situation. All right, I kept seeing a comment pop up both in the comment section and at the hands of TJump, which says, oh my gosh, Luke believes that because Christians really believe something and might even be willing to die or suffer for it, that means that their belief is true. The problem is that's not at all what I said. We were talking about pieces of evidence. Again, I'm going to emphasize that. Pieces of evidence. None of these are in and of themselves a proof. These are pieces of a puzzle that we put together to see which direction the puzzle points towards. There are a few key things here that are left out when people cite my position that I presented in this debate. One is that these are pieces of evidence that indicate and help us be pointed towards something. Another important note can be found in, surprise, surprise, the specific words I used. I tried to be very specific and precise with my conversation. When I said that when people observe something with their senses, those are words that I used in the debate. When people firsthand claim that they observed something and perceived it with their senses, and then they are willing to suffer and or die with that belief in mind, that they observed it and tested it with their senses, and when multiple people claim the same thing was observed and tested by their senses, yes, that is a good piece of evidence showing that they actually observed and sensed what they claim they did. So we're not talking about stories here. We're not talking about a very convincing storyteller who fooled people and then they believe the story and they go to their death and that points to the truth of what they believed. No, we're talking about first-hand witnesses who claim to have touched, heard, saw, etc. something and then went to their graves because of that claim. That is evidence. Is it world-stopping proof? No. But evidence, and there are a lot of pieces of evidence here that fit together and point in the same direction. The last 2 points here are that someone mentioned that it was special pleading to propose God as the final source, the ultimate source of consciousness. No, it's not special pleading because God, by his nature, has to be that thing. So the only way you can say that God is special pleading is if you say no one can ever appeal to God at all. That's ridiculous. By the nature of God being God, he accounts for the final source of consciousness. Lastly, TJump said in passing that free will had been explained away by experiments, specifically fMRI scans and advances in that field. This is literally specifically said to not be the case by the people who do these experiments. A few people accused me of misquoting atheists and agnostics in my introduction, so I will include all of the video citations to exactly what they said in context, which mean exactly what I said they meant, down below in the description. The shame of all this is it's so easy to lie, switch positions when convenient, and not let the other person talk. False claims are so easy to make, and they take a long time to unpack and debunk. If we're debating and you casually say, well, we know that most humans perceive the sky to be blue, and then I say, no, that's not true. Most humans perceive the sky to be red. I could make that false claim in like 3 seconds. And in order to prove me wrong, you'd have to dive into data, surveys, discussions on rods and cones, and it would take you a long time to disprove that false claim. That's what I was doing in this video. I hope it helped, and thanks for sticking with me through it. It's a bit long. Whether you side with TJump or TJump, I hope you learned something.